It has been a very rough few years for the Canadian news media, with layoffs, closures, and consolidations all across the country. The downsizing has been so notable that the federal government gave the nonpartisan think tank, the Public Policy Forum, the job of figuring out how to strengthen the industry while there's still an industry left. The Public Policy Forum's report was issued today. It's called The Shattered Mirror: News, Democracy, and Trust in the Digital Age. And it brings longtime Canadian journalist, now PPF president Ed Greenspon, to our studio to tell us what he discovered. Eddie, it's good to see you. Welcome back.
Hi, Steve. Good to be here.
Let's do some facts just before you and I get started. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring these up. Between the years 2008 and late 2016, 169 news outlets closed in this country, of which 60 are in the province of Ontario. 56 others reduced their service levels. 17 shifted entirely to an online focus. And 53 outlets opened. A little smattering of good news at the end there. Eddie, as part of your mission, you got Alan Gregg, who, of course, used to do a program here for many, many years. You got him out doing some public opinion surveys for you on how concerned people were about the state of legacy media in this country today. What did he find out?
Well, they are very respectful of journalism. They think the news is very important, and they associate journalism very strongly with democracy. In fact, they associate so strongly with democracy that they worry somehow or another it might be corrupted if, in some way, government gets too closely involved.
So you're encouraged by the fact that the public seems to think journalists and journalism are good?
Yeah, I was very encouraged that they see the linkage between journalism and democracy, that they see that they need to be reported on their rights, that they want to be informed. Even those who say they get most of their news off Facebook went, well, except if it's really important. And then they want to go to, I think, what we would call a trusted source, but they would actually name news outlets, name anchors, name journalists.
So they do prefer, when it's important, say the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star over Huffington Post and BuzzFeed. Is that right?
When it is important, what they consider important, they don't want to have to check in every day. They don't want to be responsible for paying for it, which is, of course, a problem.
Well,
but they do recognize that there are times when they need it, they want it, it's good for them.
I mean, that's a great segue to get me to the next part, because 9% of Canadians apparently are prepared to pay for their news online. And I guess the question is, do you think it's possible to convince the other 91% that it might be in their interest to do so as well?
Well, no. In 1995, 50% of Canadians were taking a paid newspaper, so I suppose maybe that would be a grand aspiration to get back up to that number. I don't think we'll ever get back to that kind of number, and I'm not too sure that readers are going to finance what is needed of journalism by themselves, just like advertising is no longer going to finance it adequately.
There's apparently a lot of people in this country who are very satisfied to read free, low-quality news sites, and therefore any notion that they'd be prepared to pay for something more is fanciful?
What I kept saying of them in the focus groups was they would say, I need these sites. I want these sites to exist. When I turn to them, I want there to be something there. I want to know that there's actually a site I can go to that actually sent reporters out on those things that matter to me. I want to know that they're going to have facts, not just opinion. But, I don't really want to pay for that. And they would feel guilty about that. They'd feel a little shamefaced about that. But nonetheless, that was their view.
Because the reality is we're in a culture of free these days.
That's right.
Seems to be.
So somebody else is going to have to pay. They want to be free riders.
Well, you did ask whether or not the government ought to have a role in fixing this. And 25% thought that the government should step in. But 54% were opposed to it. 75% expressed concern that journalists, if they got public money, wouldn't be impartial. And 68% worried the same thing about news organizations, that they might not be impartial if they got public money. So is government funding or a government subsidy basically a non-starter here?
Well, I'd say two things about it. First off, the more they know about crisis in newspapers, the more open they are to different kinds of solutions. Nonetheless, we felt that it was incumbent upon us to try to design a program that's respectful of that because, as journalists, we feel the same way that the public feels, right? We don't want the government too deeply involved in our lives, our newsrooms. Now, there's always been policy, CBC's policy, TV Ontario was policy. There's a special section of the Income Tax Act, which is for the media, which is policy. But we tried to design this in a way that there would be independence in a source of money and independence in how that money was allocated, and the government would be as distant as possible from any decisions.
Let's follow up on that. You have talked about creating a Future of Journalism and Democracy Fund. What is that?
Well, that is a fund that would be discretionary And people could apply to that for either journalistic projects they want to do, for the development of journalistic organizations, for digital development, because, these organizations you opened by mentioning legacy press. I don't really like the term legacy press because the legacy press is trying not to be the legacy press.
What do you prefer?
I prefer traditional or incumbent in many ways, and that's where the vast majority of news is still created in this day. Original news comes, largely from there. So we need that part of the news to work, but we also want new entrants into the field with creativity. So all of those people who are struggling, but will put journalistic boots on the ground in some way, because that's the real shortage, or will have innovative ways of using data journalism or other things, and they need some money to get over the top to do this. That would be the use of the fund, and then it would have some special initiatives attached to it, such as financing a local initiative with Canadian Press, an Indigenous news initiative with APTN, a legal services initiative where you could get legal advice for operations that are probably too small to normally hire lawyers, and doing investigative journalism and that sort. So all of those things would be financed out of the fund as well.
And who funds the fund?
So the fund, let's just let's start on both ends of this, if you will. The fund would have a governance structure that would put it far, far removed from government, further removed than the academic granting councils are today. On the other side, the money coming in would come in from a tax that would go on advertisers who are not, if you will, committed, advertising destinations that are not committed to Canadian journalism. So we've had what is called Section 19 for many years.
This is Section 19 of the Income Tax Act.
Section 19 of the Income Tax Act, first introduced in the mid-1960s for print, in the mid-1970s for broadcast, never extended to internet. And we're saying, let's extend it to internet, and let's make some adjustments so there'd be a revenue stream off it that would go into this fund. And therefore, on both ends, the fund has a level of distance from government.
I got some numbers here that basically, I think, amplify on what you're saying. Sheldon, let's bring this up. This is Board 3, please. Federal government departments currently spend $3.3 million on advertising, and here's how they spend it. Google gets about $1 million of that. Facebook gets about the same. So together, they take almost 2/3 of that money. Yahoo gets a little over $400,000, and Twitter gets almost $400,000. And you note, Edward, that these places are all headquartered in the United States. So let's start with this. Do you think the federal government ought not to be spending money on those platforms?
So one of the things we say is there'll be certain companies that become Section 19 compliant by virtue of not just their nationality, because under free trade agreements that would not be allowed, but by their commitment to doing journalism in Canada for Canada. And if they're Section 19 compliant, then they should be able to be qualify for government advertising. If they're not, government, should walk the talk. And if it believes in Canadian news media, and it says that it does, then it should be supporting that. Having said that, of course, those numbers are symbolic. They're not material to the problem at hand.
But if I understand the philosophy behind this, it is that, for example, incumbent media or longtime traditional media are doing business in Canada, they're covering Canada, they're paying taxes in Canada. These guys aren't, and they're kind of getting a free ride by stealing eyeballs away from all of those other more traditional players. Is that right?
And I wouldn't use the word stealing, because I think that they've had good business models, have been clever people, they've created product that's wanted. But we have a tradition in the country. The cable companies pay a levy to support production of television and film, and having those companies also paying into a fund that would help produce original journalism is consistent with the tradition we've had and is required if we're going to have journalism. If they want to have content that's going to feed into their system, they're going to need to help finance that.
And Netflix competes with them, and Netflix does not pay any tax.
Netflix doesn't pay tax.
Would you like to see that changed?
Google, Facebook don't pay tax. There's also, in one of the other recommendations, there's a bit of perversion because the HST, GST is not charged on subscriptions and advertising for foreign companies who are not really, for tax purposes, domiciled in Canada. And many countries have fixed that. Canada hasn't fixed that yet. We need to fix that.
You also talk about, I think people know Canadian Press. Canadian Press, a wire service, been around the country for, 100 years or something like that?
100 years this year.
100 years this year, okay. They basically cover things from a more national or international perspective. You talk about creating CP Local. What does that look like?
So what it looks like is, Where democracy is really under the most threat isn't in Ottawa. You start seeing it at the provinces, and I think you can see it with your long experience at Queen's Park, how there's far fewer journalists there and less accountability, if you will. At city levels, at courthouses, all throughout the democratic institutions, if you will, that's a problem. So we say CP Local, a parallel service, will put people into those places. CP has two things particularly going for it. It has very high standards of journalism and has held these high standards and developed them over 100 years. And it has a physical infrastructure for moving news around in ways that others really don't. So we want to give them some responsibility. Let's start with 60 to 80 reporters. It would be arrayed in places across the country and see how that works, and then go further from there.
Who do you need to green light that kind of thing to make it actually happen?
Well, you need CP really to make it happen, and you need to set up the fund, because this will be financed out of the fund. And the green light for the fund would have to come from the Government of Canada. Gotcha.
Okay, let's look at, I think this is also fairly topical, this other issue that I'm about to raise here, which is the Globe, the Star, all of the, I keep saying the Globe and the Star. I guess maybe that's because you've worked at both those places. But there's obviously lots of other incumbent or traditional media in the country as well that have been in the business for quite a long time and are very unhappy with the CBC because they see the CBC competing with them for advertisers, and the CBC puts those ads on its online site, and the CBC says, okay, you want us not to compete with you for advertisers? Government of Canada, give us $400 million more bucks, we'll vacate the space entirely. Should we let them do that?
Yes and no. So we did not concern ourselves too much with the television issue because most of the advertising isn't in the news side of television. On digital, it pretty well all is news, and indeed about 3/4 of the traffic that goes to television, to the website, is news destination traffic. So we say the CBC should get out of digital advertising. We say that not because there's going to be $25 million that's automatically going to go to the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail, because it's not going to go there. Right now, 82.4% of digital ad impressions are going to Google and Facebook in this country. Only 11.5% are going to Canadian publishers. But we say they should do that because we've never had a time where we've needed the CBC to be good and serious and take its civic responsibilities of journalism more seriously than today. And ads sort of pull you and induce you a little bit more towards clickbait, towards cat stories rather than legislative stories.
So let's get them out of that business entirely?
And so let's get any of that kind of incentive away from them so they can really keep focused on serious journalism.
Any indication whether the Government of Canada would be interested in giving the CBC even more money than they promised to give them during the last election campaign in order to do this?
Well, the amount of money we're talking about here for digital ads is $25 million. It's a very, very small slice of that $400 million that you were talking about. So I think a deal can be cut somehow or another.
Now, you write in your report that all of the changes that we have talked about that you are now recommending would lead to $300 to $400 million per year in new revenue for journalism in Canada. And my question is, if in fact that happens, what would that actually do?
Well, $300 to $400 million is a pretty material amount of money to help new journalistic enterprises get going, to help, let's say, La Presse move to the next generation of its tablet app. But we don't want to absolve the industry of its responsibility here, too. This shouldn't be a totally public-supported enterprise. These are still, private enterprises and not-for-profits that we're seeing increasing numbers of. So it would help them, get them through a transition, help finance. But ultimately, people are going to have to figure this out, and usually the people who figure it out are somebody who's on the outside coming in. That's the way disruption tends to work.
Sure, but having said that, you've made some perfectly fine recommendations here, but then people will read in their newspapers and hear discussed on television and radio the fact that Post Media, for example, I don't mean to pick on them, but it's recent, they've laid off dozens and dozens and dozens of people over the last couple of years, and then they see that, they've paid out millions of dollars in ad bonuses to their executives to keep them from presumably going somewhere else, although I'm not sure where else they could go in this kind of market. What kind of optics does that present?
So what that does is it tells you should have a discretionary fund where the people running the fund can decide who's going to use the money well to make sure that it meets the objectives that we're looking for, which is preserving journalists. And by the way, we've estimated based on union numbers that 1/3 of journalism jobs have disappeared in the last 6 years. So, a lot of jobs are are going. Rather than an alternative way, which some people in the industry have been asking for, which is a tax credit system, which would go to everybody, regardless of whether they're going to use it well or not going to use it well, how they're going to use it. So we're saying a discretion, that was a major choice that we had to make. Is it going to be a general kind of principle, or is it going to be a discretionary principle? And I think you bring up one of the reasons why discretionary is a superior way to go.
And some people might also ask, some of what it sounds like you're asking this new media landscape to do, many people have traditionally thought this is really the bailiwick of CBC. We expect them to do this kind of national, provincial, and local mission-oriented kind of journalism. Not the case anymore?
Well, you know, I think first of all, you can only put so much on the CBC. The CBC does do an excellent job in much of its reporting. There's certain legislatures where they don't have full-time reporters anymore. So Saskatchewan and Manitoba seems to be the same. So I think that is a bit of a problem in the allocation of CBC resources. But it is not for us on the report, and it's certainly not for the Government of Canada to tell CBC management how it should deploy reporters. That would be wrong, completely wrong. I think the principle that we'd be operating here is that we need a strong CBC, but we need a diverse system as well. So there's got to be other voices, there's got to be other ways of looking at the world, and you can't put too much on the shoulders of CBC.
And one wonders as well whether or not these ideas that you've put forward and the $300 to $400 million a year that might be brought into a new system would actually save the traditional media or merely delay their inevitable demise. What do you think?
Well, I think that's a bit of an imponderable. So I've been in that traditional media, and I've been trying to stave off that demise in portions of my life, and it's been difficult. You know, as you know, Steve, I launched globeandmail.com, and I was looking at one of the surprises as I compiled numbers for this report. Is I'm looking at digital revenues for the newspaper industry, and they're stuck at 230 million. They were 230 million 10 years ago, and they're 240 million today. So you've had this growth of the industry from about a little under $1 billion then to $5.5 billion this year, and the newspaper industry's stuck. So the things that we thought might be the salvation have not been the salvation. I think different enterprises, different outlets are trying different kinds of strategies more appropriate to themselves, and that experimentation, some of them might make it, some of them won't make it. The important thing is that democracy makes it, that there's journalists on the ground wherever they work, whatever medium they're in, however it turns out, who are holding politicians to account, who are holding communities together with common pools of civic information. That's what's important.
Let me ask you one last thing in our last 30 seconds here, and that is, again, I want to go back to Saskatchewan. One of the focus groups you held in Regina, you had one of the participants say, somehow, somewhere, someone will figure this all out. And my question is, really? Like, maybe not, eh?
Well, I'll put you in touch with the person in Saskatchewan who said that. And, you know, if you look at classic disruption theory, and there is a whole theory around this economically, someone somehow does figure it out, but you also sometimes get market failures. And digital media requires vast scale to be able to make money as we understand it now. Vast scale, bigger than Canada, certainly bigger than Saskatchewan. So I'm not too sure that the economics line up without some kind of other outlet for money coming in.
Lots of food for thought, Ed. Thanks so much for coming into TVO tonight and helping us out with this.
Thank you, Steve.
That's Ed Greenspon, president of the Public Policy Forum.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.